New Zealand is known for many things, to say the very least, including its unique 3-foot 6-inch gauge railway system. For the longest time, we haven't had that many Kiwi routes in Train Simulator, but thanks to the efforts of a third-party developer called NZTS Workshops, we finally have a decent quality payware route in the game. These are my 2 cents on the Midland Line, Springfield to Aickens route. This add-on was released in January 2021, and just over 4 years later, it is still available on Steam for a full price of $50 New Zealand dollars. Unfortunately, you don't get the entire Christchurch to Greymouth route here, just the 90 kilometres of track from Springfield to Aickens, but the section that we do get is hardly unremarkable. The small town of Springfield is still on the Canterbury Plains, but it lies at the foot of the Southern Alps, while Aickens is a tiny settlement 7 kilometres north of Aotearoa. This route is set in 1968, back in the New Zealand Railways era, and 40 years before KiwiRail was created. In those days, the Aotearoa to Arthur's Pass section was still electrified, as the operating environment through the steeply graded Aotearoa tunnel was completely unsuitable for steam locomotives. 1968 also saw the opening of a new station building at Arthur's Pass, which differs greatly from what you would expect from a traditional NZR station. And for comparison, here's what the station building's interior looks like in real life, as recorded on the 29th of October 2024. 1968 was also when the DJ class diesel locomotives first entered service, and right around the time when the original electric locomotives for the Aotearoa tunnel were replaced by newer engines built by Toshiba of Japan. Unfortunately, the Drury 88-seater railcars, also known as Fiat railcars, are not included in this add-on, even though they were still running Christchurch to Greymouth services in the late 60s. The overhead wires between Aotearoa and Arthur's Pass were removed in 1997, and since then, heavily modified DX-class diesel locomotives, originally built by General Electric in the 1970s, have been the dominant motive power on the Midland Line. In addition to freight services, the route is also used by the famous TranzAlpine passenger train, which runs once a day in each direction between Christchurch and Greymouth. But, like the other 2 surviving long-distance services in New Zealand, the TranzAlpine is primarily aimed at tourists these days. The old turntable at Arthur's Pass still exists, but it's only used on rare occasions, and even then, usually only to turn locomotives when they bring in an excursion train from Christchurch. As for the nearby water tower, that's now long gone. As some additional opportunities to compare buildings in the game with their real-life counterparts, here's the Aotearoa Hotel, and Springfield Station. Much like Arthur's Pass, the rendition in TS Classic is very accurate to the real thing, although the yard has been significantly rationalised in the years since 1968. When I visited Springfield, I couldn't help noticing this unusual pair of diesel shunters parked under the goods shed's canopy. The white and brown one is DS213, built in 1953, while the red, yellow and grey one is A&G Price Model 11 number 213, built in 1964. 213 was previously based at the now closed mainline steam depot in Christchurch. Thinking back to the TS Classic version of the Midland Line, I strongly recommend reading through its manual, as the developers go into a lot of detail on how the route's signalling works, as well as driving instructions for the two included locomotives. On the motive power scene, this route includes the New Zealand Railways DJ diesel and EO electric locomotives. The DJ is the dominant motive power for most of the route, while the EO takes charge between Aotearoa and Arthur's Pass. You can also get the JA and KB steam locomotives, which are sold separately, but I will not be covering them in depth for this review because, to be brutally honest, they test my patience to no end, despite the fact that the JA is still my favourite steam locomotive in real life. In all honesty, I think the TS versions of the JA and KB are absolute pigs to drive, especially when you're trying to set up the KB's booster unit, although I did manage it once. And the less said about the sounds on these locomotives, the better. The DJ is a curious beast, not least because of her strange bow wheel arrangement. That means 3 bogies with 2 axles each, and all 6 axles are powered. 64 of these things were built by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of Japan in 1968 and 1969, with the intention being to replace all steam locomotives in the South Island, but regular steam operations in New Zealand didn't finish until 1971. The DJ was one of at least 3 New Zealand locomotive types to have the bow wheel arrangement. The other 2 were the EW class of 1952 and the EF class of 1988. It's also worth mentioning that you can buy an extra livery pack for the DJ class, which costs $24.79 NZD at full price. Combining this pack with what you get in the base route, you've essentially got just about every single livery these locomotives ever carried, at least in their working days. You don't get a variant of DJ 3096 when she had the little TranzRail logo during her time in Northland, or the preservation-era liveries seen on the engines based in Dunedin, and the unique mainline steam black with blue stripes, as seen on the preserved DJs 1228 and 1229. The 1970s and 1980s era liveries should have the old New Zealand Rail logo on the cab side, as per reality, but the logo doesn't appear in TS, presumably due to licensing restrictions. Driving the DJ is an interesting experience, partly because of the view out the cab window. Although this isn't quite a high hood locomotive, the DJ's short hood is still tall enough for you to feel like you're driving a high hood, like the DA class. Upon revisiting the Nippon Pink DJ that comes with the base route, I noticed that the brakes were not as finicky as I remember. On the other hand, the EO is still equipped with the so-called advanced brakes, which I consider to be more annoying than anything else. On the EO, you do at least have the option to reduce the braking difficulty, and this applies to the DJs from the extra livery pack too. The route itself includes 7 scenarios, with 3 of them split into 2 parts each, while the DJ livery pack adds an additional 10 scenarios. They cover realistic services and situations along the Midland Line, and I particularly like the ones where you get to haul freight with the EO electrics, even though the EO is not all that easy to drive. Another scenario that I like is called Tramped Out. In this one, you get to drive DJ 1255 in a strange blue livery with grey cab and wasp stripes, on a short passenger run from Aickens to Aotearoa. If anyone can explain when and why this bizarre livery came about, please do so in the comments. As for the EO class electric locomotive, these were built by English Electric in 1922, but they didn't enter service until 1923, and only 5 examples of this design were ever built. These locomotives were used to haul trains through the Orthiedra tunnel, as it would have been far too dangerous to have steam locomotives run on this section. The tunnel is just over 8 kilometers long and on a steep 1 in 33 gradient, going uphill towards Arthur's Pass. EOs would often run coupled as a trio, with the other 2 engines presumably being kept as backup at the Orthiedra shed. These locomotives were originally built with a cab at both ends, but in 1940 they were rebuilt with a single cab arrangement, and the remaining cab was modified with smaller windows. In 1968 they were retired and replaced by the Toshiba-built EA class, which would later be reclassified as EO. Only one example of each EO class has survived into preservation, and both EO3 and EO45 can be found at the Ferrymead Railway in Christchurch, but as far as I know, EO45 is not in working order. As for EO3, she arrived at the railway in 1972 and was initially restored to working order in 1977, complete with the 1940 rebuilt cab at one end and the original style cab reinstated at the other. Personally, I prefer the look of the rebuilt cab over the original, but each to their own. A depot was built at Orthiedra for the electric locomotives, and this is recreated very well in TS, complete with animated doors and everything. However, the real thing has long since been demolished, and the whole yard is no longer the hive of activity that it once was, as I saw upon my visits in October 2024. Besides the DJ and EO locomotives, the Midland Line add-on also includes a great variety of rolling stock, and here's the selection. K3 and K5 wooden box vans, KP1 aluminium vans, LA4 and LA6 open wagons. The LA was one of the most common wagons on the NZR system. LC2 and LC3 open wagons, which were essentially just a bigger version of the LA. The M5 wooden low side wagon, which also has a tarpaulin load. The U2 bogie flatbed wagon, which has either logs or timber loads. UC3 tanker wagons. V3 and VB1 insulated box wagons, which would have been used for carrying frozen meat. A-class passenger coaches. AF-class car van, essentially that's the Kiwi term for brake coach. And the F-class guards van, specifically the 30-foot and 50-foot variants. Back in the late 1960s, NZR still used plenty of four-wheel wagons, in stark contrast to the modern KiwiRail scene, where four-wheelers are now a thing of the past. Although, for the longest time, four-wheelers could still be found on log trains in Northland well into the KiwiRail era. Additional freight and passenger rolling stock for the Midland Line is available with the JA and KB steam locomotives, as well as a few dedicated wagon packs on steam. Although they would not match the time period of the Springfield to Aickens route in TS Classic, I would still love to see the unusual G-Class 462 Pacifics brought to the game, since those things used to run between Springfield and Arthur's Pass. Out of all the non-powered rolling stock that comes with this route, my favourite is easily the A-Class passenger coaches and AF car van, with their old-fashioned wooden bodies and open balconies at each end. Incidentally, these coaches in TS come with 2 variants each, fitted with either gas or electric lighting. On a personal note, I've been lucky enough to ride aboard the real things many times on heritage railways or mainline excursions. 3 of these coaches, specifically AA 1678, A1196 and A1288, can be found at the Goldfields Railway in Waihi, and one of their classmates, AA 1484, is now used as the Serial Griller Diner in Oakura, a fairly sizable distance from the nearest active railway line in New Plymouth. Ordinarily, you can press the 5 key to access the passenger view, but the NZR coaches and TS do not have a passenger view, for whatever reason. In addition to all the rolling stock I've just mentioned, and the extras available on Steam, NZTS workshops also have a freeware model of the Dubs A040 tank engine, which is available to download on the Train Simulation New Zealand website. Although the Dubs A's never ran on the Midland Line in real life, it's nice to still have this dinky little thing in the game. On another personal note, I was lucky to see one of the preserved Dubs A's in real life, specifically A64 at the Plains Railway near Ashburton, although I haven't seen this engine running under her own power yet. Come to think of it, if someone ever made the Piha tramway as a TS Classic route, you could also run the Dubs A on that. For reference, the specific Dubs A that ran on the Piha tramway was A62, otherwise known as A196. As for any other payware New Zealand motive power for TS Classic, only two options come to mind. There's the ADL/ADC diesel multiple unit, modelled by Chris Trains, and two variants of the DA class, modelled by Diesel Workshop. At the time of this video's production, in February 2025, you can still buy the ADL and DA packs. The two DA variants are sold separately, for some reason, and they cost $16.39 each on Diesel Workshop's website, while the ADL is $20.56 if you buy it from Chris Trains' website. I will include links to the Dubs A, ADL, and DA in the description. Of course, from a historical accuracy perspective, it makes absolutely no sense to run the DA or ADL on the Midland Line, but sometimes I do it anyway just because I can. In the case of the DA class, apart from one instance with the now preserved DA 1471, none of these locomotives ever ran in the South Island until well into the preservation era. The scenery details are, dare I say it, pretty damn good, but it leads to a major issue that I'll discuss shortly. Aside from the accurate station models, there's an absolute myriad of foliage and lineside clutter details all throughout the route. My favourite spots are Springfield Station, the Patterson's Creek Viaduct, Broken River Viaduct, Cass Bank, the section through Mount White Halt and alongside the Waimakariri River, and, of course, the electrified section between Aotearoa and Arthur's Pass. This section of the line runs through a very remote part of New Zealand, in stark contrast to the big and bustling city of Christchurch. Indeed, the South Island is very sparsely populated as a whole, and even Springfield is just a small town with a population of only 370 people as of June 2023. I had a little chuckle when I saw that one of the waypoints on the Midland Line is named Craigieburn, even if only because it reminded me of the Craigieburn suburban line in Melbourne, Australia. One of many iconic spots on the route, to rail fans at least, is the engine shed at Springfield. This was often used as a base for the KB class 484 steam locomotives, of which there were only 6 examples ever built, with one surviving into preservation. The KBs are the stuff of legend in the railway community thanks to their years spent hauling freight trains between Springfield and Arthur's Pass. This section wasn't referred to as KB country for nothing. On the whole, the immersive sounds aren't too bad. Some of my favourites are the birds chirping, which can be heard all throughout the route, and the classic sound of Griswold mechanical bells on the Pocock Road level crossing at Springfield. For comparison, here's how the real crossing looks as of late October 2024. At some point, although I obviously don't know when, the mechanical bells were replaced by what I think are W.C. Hayes e-bells. However, the route is certainly not flawless. The one major issue I've always had with it has been the wildly inconsistent frame rates. Indeed, the route was so laggy on my old computer that it was completely unplayable, even after lowering the graphics settings considerably. Even after the route was updated a few times and I upgraded to a decent gaming PC, I still have a pretty laggy experience. But to be fair, it wasn't as bad as before. I could be wrong on this, but I suspect the frame rate drops are caused by the use of excessive amounts of 3D trees as distant scenery. Normally the frame rate hovers between 30 and 60 FPS, but it can absolutely plummet depending on A, what part of the route you're on, and B, which way you're pointing the camera. Another major issue I found was in the scenario editor. Sometimes the scenery will load properly, and you'll get the normal frame rates. But other times, and I'm not sure why this happens, the scenery will be all blacks like the national rugby team, and the frame rate hovers around a measly 15 FPS at best and 4 FPS at worst, but it returns to normal in driver mode. I don't recall seeing this problem on any other route, and at this point, I've lost count of how many I've got in my TS collection. The most annoying part of making this video was when I tried to record footage of the Dubs A tank engines at Cass. I made multiple attempts, but the game kept freezing with no warning. It's one thing when the game crashes, but randomly freezing is much worse because I have to do a forced restart on the computer every time that happens. Given that I'm on the 64-bit version of TS, there shouldn't be any reason for the game to randomly freeze. But the good thing is that I still managed to record enough footage at Cass for the specific part of the video where it was needed. If you can put aside the wildly inconsistent performance, this route is pretty good, and I'm not saying that just because it's from the same country as me. It offers quite a challenging driving experience through some of New Zealand's most remote and scenic terrain, not to mention the unusual practice of driving the EO electrics between Aotearoa and Arthur's Pass. Although the inconsistent performance lets the route down a fair bit, I still think it's worthy of a 7.5 out of 10, but I can only recommend this route if you've got a really powerful PC.